On a Prayer, Faith is Awaken by Elton Thomas. Episode 17, The Hunter and the Hunted. Jackson Brown stood in the shadows of his office, his cold blue eyes fixed on the city skyline. The dim light from the single lamp on his desk cast long, jagged shadows across the room, making his sleek figure appear even more menacing. St. Louis stretched out beneath him, a city that had always bent to his will, a playground where he had built an empire on fear and corruption. But tonight, something was different. Dusty Rhymes. The name had been little more than a nuisance at first, a whisper in the back alleys, a man who had taken down a few small players in Jackson's network. But now, Dusty was more than a thorn in his side. He was a threat, and that was something Jackson could not tolerate. Jackson's jaw tightened as he thought about the reports he'd been getting from his men. Failed ambushes, narrow escapes. It was as if Dusty were slipping through his fingers at every turn, moving with a precision and speed that defied logic. And now, Dusty was getting closer. Too close. Jackson turned away from the window, his movements deliberate and controlled as he approached his desk. A man stood in front of him, one of his most trusted enforcers, shifting nervously under Jackson's calculating gaze. The air in the room was thick with tension, and the silence between them crackled like the calm before a storm. "You're telling me," Jackson said slowly, his voice as cold as ice, "that Rhymes took out 5 of my men, again, and you still haven't put him down?" The enforcer swallowed hard, his hands clenched at his sides as he avoided Jackson's piercing gaze. "He's not like the others," the man muttered, his voice strained with fear. It's like he knows what we're going to do before we do it. He moves faster than anyone I've ever seen. It's not normal, boss." Jackson's eyes narrowed, his patience wearing thin. "Not normal?" he repeated, his voice dripping with disdain. "I don't pay you to make excuses. I pay you to get results." The enforcer shifted uncomfortably, beads of sweat forming on his forehead as he struggled to find the right words. "We'll get him, boss," he stammered. "We just need more time. He's been unpredictable." Jackson's lips curled into a cold smile, but there was no humor in his eyes. "Time is something we don't have," he said quietly. "Dusty Rhymes is getting closer, and if he finds Mila before we finish the job, then all of this," he gestured around the room, "falls apart." The enforcer nodded quickly, his heart pounding in his chest. "We'll get him," he repeated, more for his own reassurance than Jackson's. Jackson's gaze flicked back to the window, his mind already working through the possibilities. He knew Dusty was smart, resourceful, but there was something else happening, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Dusty was moving with a speed and precision that didn't make sense. He had survived situations that should have killed him, evaded traps that no one else could have escaped, and that made him dangerous. Jackson's eyes hardened as he turned back to the enforcer. "I want you to find him," he ordered, his voice low and deadly. "Find him, and finish this. I don't care how many men it takes. Dusty Rhymes dies tonight." The enforcer nodded, his hands trembling slightly as he hurried out of the room, leaving Jackson alone in the darkness. For a long moment, Jackson stood there, his mind cold and calculating as he considered his next move. Dusty was close, but Jackson was always one step ahead. He would make sure of that. Dusty moved through the dark streets of St. Louis like a shadow, his body tense, every nerve on high alert. The city felt different tonight, as if the air itself was charged with the knowledge that something big was coming. He could feel it, a shift in the atmosphere that made his skin prickle, made his pulse quicken. He knew Jackson was aware of him, knew that the walls were closing in. But Dusty wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Over the past few days, something inside him had changed. His movements were faster, his reflexes sharper, his senses more attuned to the world around him. It was as if his body had been rewired, pushed beyond its limits by an unseen force. He couldn't explain it. He barely understood it. But he could feel the power coursing through him, growing stronger with each passing day. It wasn't just luck that had saved him from the ambushes, from the bullets that had whizzed past his head. It was something more. Faith. Dusty's jaw clenched as he pushed the thought away. He wasn't ready to accept that yet. He wasn't ready to believe that the prayers of others were the reason he was still alive. But as he moved through the city, his body reacting with a speed and strength he couldn't explain, he couldn't deny that something was happening. As Dusty approached the warehouse district, the streets grew quieter, the sounds of the city fading into the background. He had been tracking Jackson's men for hours, moving through the back alleys, avoiding the main streets, staying just out of sight. He knew they were hunting him, circling him like predators waiting for the right moment to strike. But Dusty wasn't the prey anymore. He was the hunter. His body moved with a fluidity that felt almost superhuman. His senses were sharper than they had ever been. He could hear the faintest sounds, see movement in the shadows long before anyone else would have noticed. It was as if he were operating on a different level, a higher plane of existence where time itself seemed to slow down around him. And then, he saw them. 3 men, standing near the entrance to a warehouse, their eyes scanning the streets, their hands resting on the guns at their sides. Dusty's pulse quickened, but his movements remained calm, deliberate. He slipped into the shadows, watching them from a distance, his mind working through the possibilities. They were waiting for him. Jackson had sent them to finish the job, but Dusty wasn't going to let that happen. He moved silently, his body a blur of motion as he circled around the warehouse, using the darkness to his advantage. The wind howled through the empty streets, carrying with it the faint scent of rain. Dusty could feel the storm coming, both in the air and in his soul. Tonight was the night. He crouched behind a stack of old crates, his breathing steady as he waited. The men were talking, their voices low, unaware that Dusty was watching them. He could see the tension in their bodies, the way their fingers twitched toward their guns every time they heard a sound. They were nervous. They knew Dusty was out there. Dusty closed his eyes for a moment, centering himself, feeling the power inside him growing stronger. His senses sharpened, his body coiling like a spring ready to explode. He knew what he had to do. In a flash, Dusty moved. The first man barely had time to register what was happening before Dusty was on him. His movements were impossibly fast, his body a blur as he disarmed the man in one fluid motion, twisting his arm behind his back and knocking him unconscious with a single blow. The second man turned, his eyes wide with shock, but Dusty was faster. He ducked under the man's outstretched arm, delivering a sharp jab to his ribs that sent him crashing to the ground. The third man fumbled for his gun, his hands shaking as he tried to raise it, but Dusty was already there. With a lightning-fast kick, he knocked the gun from the man's hand, sending it skittering across the pavement. The man stumbled back, his face pale with fear as he realized he was no match for the force standing before him. Dusty's eyes were cold, focused, as he stepped closer. "Where's Jackson?" he demanded, his voice low and deadly. The man stammered, his back pressed against the wall. I don't know," he gasped. "He doesn't tell us where he goes. I swear, I don't know." Dusty's jaw tightened, but he could see the fear in the man's eyes. He was telling the truth. Without another word, Dusty turned and disappeared into the night, leaving the men behind him, broken and defeated. His heart pounded in his chest, the adrenaline still surging through his veins, but his mind was clear. Jackson was out there, circling him, waiting for the right moment to strike. But Dusty wasn't afraid. He could feel the power growing inside him, the strength that came not just from his own abilities, but from something greater. The hunter had become the hunted, but Dusty knew one thing for certain. He wasn't the one being chased anymore. He was the one leading the way.